Watch very carefully because no one can explain the prophecy on this timeline. If you go on Google and you search the ancient name for Iran, you will see one answer, Persia. But that's only half true because there is actually another name, one that holds a prophecy that the whole world forgot about. You probably already know Iran from the news, but did you know where this country actually comes from? Well, our story goes way back to around 2400 BC, and we are going to meet a man that you have definitely heard of, Noah. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth. But here's where it gets interesting. His oldest son, Shem, had a son called Elam. But Elam wasn't just an ordinary kid, because in 2000 BC, Elam became the forefather of the Elamites. Okay, now take a good look at this. The name Elam actually means high in Assyrian, meaning the land was high up. These highlands weren't just some random hills, they stretch for about 1,000 miles, all the way from near Babylon towards the Mediterranean. Over time, both the land and the people changed and grew. The Elamites, who started out a lot like the early Sumerians, eventually became part of what we now call Iran. Did you catch that? In other words, every time the Bible talks about Elam, it's pointing directly to the very beginnings of Persia. So make sure you remember that name, because this timeline will reveal a very surprising prophecy about the people of Elam. Or should I say, the people of Iran. Let's jump forward 100 years to 1900 BC, because something huge is about to shake the people of Elam. The action kicks off during one of the Bible's earliest battles, the rescue of Lot by Abraham. Before you find out who wins, you need to see where it all happened. This is the Valley of Siddim near the Dead Sea, a place famously dotted with tar pits. And these pits would become a nightmare for one group of soldiers. Here's how it went down. 5 kings from the Jordan decided to rebel against Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam. He had ruled them for 12 years. And Chedorlaomer, well, he didn't take the rebellion lightly. He called on his 3 key allies and marched south into Canaan. Elam was victorious, so much so that its enemies reached the Vale of Siddim. The valley's tar pits swallowed some fleeing soldiers, while the remaining ran for the hills. As you can imagine, the king of Elam didn't stop there, and so the rebellious cities were raided and the citizens were carried off. Lot was one of them. This is the part where the tables turned, and not in a way that people expected. Abraham, another famous man from the Bible, decided that he and his 318 trained men from his household would not sit around. So he pursued the victorious kings north, all the way past Dan, and launched a night ambush. By God's guidance alone, Abraham routed Chedorlaomer's forces, recovering Lot, the other captives, and all the stolen goods. I was so taken aback the first time I saw this, because straight after the battle, Abraham meets Melchizedek, the king of Salem, a priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek blesses Abraham, offers him bread and wine, and makes it clear that it was God who had delivered Abraham's enemies into his hands. This is not a detail we can just skip past because it was a beautiful picture of another high priest, a king who would come thousands of years later and who would also tell all those who trust in him to share in his supper, the bread and wine. And we do this to remember the death that he died for us. I suppose what I'm really trying to say here is that Melchizedek was a sneak peek that points to the eternal King of Kings, the God-man, Jesus Christ. In 559 BC, our story takes a dramatic turn. Enter Cyrus II, later called Cyrus the Great. We pick up straight after Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem. It is here where we find Cyrus is now leading the Persians. Next he married the daughter of the Median king Astyages. This literally united the Persian tribes and other Iranian peoples. You would think his father-in-law would be happy, but not King Astyages. No, he saw him as a problem, and unbelievably, he was right. In a clever campaign, Cyrus defeated Astyages and even convinced some of his troops to join him. And you thought your family had drama. By 550 BC, the Median Empire was gone and the Persian Empire was born. But here's the part most historians forget to mention. The Bible had predicted Cyrus's rise at least 150 years before he was born. Isaiah calls him shepherd and anointed, saying he would conquer nations and rebuild Jerusalem and even the temple. I believe the most unreal part of this prediction, though, is the fact that Cyrus is specifically named in Isaiah 44, verse 28. Even Cyrus himself is said to have read these words and to have been amazed by the accuracy of Scripture. But what do you think? Do you think God was clearly guiding history using a king to fulfill a plan he'd written centuries earlier? Or do you think it's all just one big coincidence? One thing cannot be denied. Cyrus didn't stop after uniting Persia. He went on to crush the Lydians in the west. And then he turned his eyes towards Babylon, the most incredible city anyone had ever seen. Imagine this scenario. Walls so tall that they make you feel like an ant. These walls are over 90 meters high, and they're broad enough for chariots to race along the top. They have bronze gates gleaming in the sun and towers that even touch the clouds. Are you imagining this right now? Because even the elusive Euphrates River flowed right through the middle, keeping the city rich and alive. However, inside these grand walls, pride ruled as much as any king. One night, while King Belshazzar was throwing a wild feast, whilst he was drinking from cups that were stolen from God's temple in Jerusalem, an unexplainable hand appeared out of nowhere and wrote glowing words across the wall. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. It sounds almost unbelievable, but it really happened. But what made matters even worse is that no one knew what it meant until Daniel was brought in. He explained that Babylon's time was up and that God would give the kingdom to the Medes and Persians. That very night, as the Parsi roared on, the prophecy came true. Cyrus's troops had made an incredibly calculating move. They had quietly diverted the Euphrates River, lowering its water until they could sneak right under the city walls, through the riverbed. Normally, those huge inner gates of bronze and iron would have stopped them cold, but on that night, unusually, they had left them wide open. The soldiers slipped in without even breaking a fingernail, and before dawn, Babylon had fallen, exactly as God said it would. But hey now, I can hear exactly what you're thinking. Joe, is this the ancient prophecy that most people don't know about? No, it's not. This one came from Isaiah, and it was written about 200 years earlier than Belshazzar's party. In this prophecy that we're talking about, it predicted that God would break in pieces the gates of brass and cut through the bars of iron. And it even describes how the loins of the king would tremble. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. Belshazzar was removed, Darius the Mede took charge under Cyrus's new empire, and Daniel found favor once again, serving near the top of the kingdom. Not long after the dust had settled, in around 539 BC, Daniel faced one of his most unforgettable moments of life. The lion's den. Under the new Medo-Persian rule, jealous officials tricked Darius into signing a law that banned prayer for anyone except the king. Daniel, being Daniel, kept praying anyway, and so what happened? He was thrown into the den of lions. But God shut their mouths, and that night he showed the whole Persian court that the living God of Israel ruled over every empire, over every creature, even lions, and that no one should mess with a man of God. Now, I do want you to pay close attention because Babylon, the city that once mocked God and crushed his people, was now finished. So let's just pause on that for a second. Because through this Iranian man, God was setting his people free, just as he promised to do long ago. Don't forget that fact, because it will leave you speechless when you see the powerful plot twist later on this timeline. But right now, listen to this. Though Babylon now lies in ruins, the Bible tells us of another Babylon yet to come. It talks about it in the last book of the Bible, Revelation. Just like the first Babylon, this one too will fall. So my friend, I can assure you of one thing. No empire, no matter how powerful, no matter how great there is a man on this world, no matter how famous, none of them can stand forever. None of them can stand against God's plans. So that is why you would be very wise to stand in the light of the Lord Jesus Christ right now, before the darkness of Babylon rises up again. By the way, if you doubt the Bible's reliability, fix your eyes on this archaeological discovery. This clay artifact is known as Cyrus's cylinder. It's super old. It's dated to 538 BC, making this football-sized artifact 2,560 years old. So what makes this clay tube so special anyway? Well, it's what it says on it that turns heads. Covered by ancient Akkadian writing, it states that Cyrus declares that the conquered peoples by the Babylonians are now free to return to their lands, free to rebuild their temples, free to worship their own God. You do realise how massive this is. Empires never freed their captives. It was unheard of. But Cyrus did. But if you thought that was special, wait until you hear this. The Bible also records a near identical decree, but it's addressed to the Jews. In Ezra chapter 1 verses 2 to 3, Cyrus writes, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem." Guys, that's not just tolerance from a Persian king, but rather a man acknowledging that the God of Israel is the real boss. Okay, I know how much you guys love archaeology, so get a load of this. Under Cyrus's command, the exiles began their long journey home. By 538 BC, the first wave finally arrived in Jerusalem, and step by step they started to rebuild the temple. This is the very structure that would later be known as the Second Temple. Centuries have passed, and yet we still have remains of it today. There's the Robinson's Arch jutting out over the western wall, the massive stones of the Temple Mount itself, ritual baths, the remnants of the Hulda Gates, and even the trumpeting stone where priests once announced their festivals. This was all only possible because God used the Iranian King Cyrus to fulfill his plans. And that is exactly why this Persian end times prophecy that very few know about makes total sense. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense at all. I was really struck by the next period of our timeline. In around 525 BC, Persia had gone from a small regional power to one of the biggest empires in the world. And Daniel, living in the courts of Babylon and later Persia, got visions from the Lord that predicted all of this with a scary accuracy. Do you know what one of the most striking visions was? In Daniel chapters 7 to 8, Daniel saw 4 unexpected creatures rising from chaotic waters. One of these creatures was a huge bear. It was raised on one side, and that was supposed to symbolize Persia. That lean, it showed that Persia would rule over its neighbor, the Medes. Daniel also saw 3 ribs in the bear's mouth. Those were Persia's major conquests: Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. So come on now. What do you think? What do you think went down after Daniel saw this? Well, you're not wrong. Persia crushed Lydia in Asia Minor, took Babylon in 539 BC, and under Cambyses II marched across Sinai to defeat Egypt's pharaoh at Pelusium. Simply put, Daniel's vision wasn't just imagination, it was a preview of real history. May I go deeper? Daniel saw another creature, a ram with 2 horns. One horn was longer than the other, changing in every direction. What was this ram meant to represent? It was the kings of the Medes and Persia, unstoppable in their conquests. The taller horn hinted that Persia would rule over the Medes, but just then, Daniel sees something else. A swift goat suddenly appears from the west, striking the ram with a single horn. You see, that goat wasn't just any animal, it symbolized Greece under Alexander the Great, showing how even the mighty Persian Empire, unstoppable as it seemed, would be overpowered by a new force sweeping in from the west. And then a leopard appears, fast, ruthless, with 4 wings and 4 heads. At first it doesn't make any sense until nearly 2 centuries later when Alexander the Great arrives. It's 333 BC, and this young Macedonian king moves faster than anyone before him. At Issus, the Persians, led by King Darius III, collapse in chaos. Darius flees, leaving his family behind, and they eventually got taken away by Alexander. 2 years later, in 331 BC, the final strike lands at Gaugamela, completing the Persian Empire's fall. Finally comes the 4th and last beast in Daniel's vision. This is by far the scariest. Unlike any kingdom before, it has iron teeth, claws and strength that crushes everything in its path. And when you look at the timeline of world history, it's obvious which beast is being represented here. Rome. A kingdom so powerful and so ruthless, it would rule the world for centuries. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, because the world under Roman rule was the world that Jesus lived in when he walked on earth. And in the end, it was Roman soldiers who nailed him to a cross. And yet, that wasn't Rome's doing. It was all part of God's plan all along. On that cross, Jesus took our place, carrying our sin, our wrongdoing, so that you and I can be forgiven and free. Just a little diversion. In case you haven't realised yet, I am a Bible-believing Christian. And about 10 years ago, I made a choice not to run any commercials, any adverts on this channel. I just wanted the gospel to go out freely without any distractions. It has been a very exciting journey so far, and if you'd like to be part of it, and you're not against seeing ad-free content in the future, please do subscribe. Alright, last time I checked, this was one of the world's biggest ziggurats, and it's found in Susa, the capital of Persia. And it is here, in this city, that it would become the stage for one of the world's most unexpected miracles. You and I have arrived in the Book of Esther at a time when Persia is at its peak. Yes, ancient Iran has just become the largest empire the world has ever seen, stretching from India to Ethiopia. That's an impressive span of 3,000 miles. But I wonder if anyone else is asking, where are we on the timeline now? Well, it's around 480 BC, nearly 60 years after Cyrus first freed the Jewish exiles to return home. Some have gone back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, but many decided to stay behind in Persia. That's where our story unfolds. The king on the throne is King Xerxes I, known in the Bible as Ahasuerus. He was ruling from 486 to 465 BC. History tells us he's the same ruler who launched massive wars against Greece and who lived in incredible luxury at his palace in Susa, which is what we now know to be modern-day Iran. My friend, it all begins with a scandal at the royal feast. Xerxes calls for his queen Vashti to show off her beauty before the other nobles. She is totally embarrassed and refuses. So in a rage, he removes her from her crown. The king is now single and looking to mingle, and so he calls for a nationwide search for a new queen. And as you can probably imagine from what we already know about this guy, beauty was the #1 requirement. Among the many beautiful women brought to the palace, there was a young Jewish woman named Hadassah, known by her Persian name as Esther. She's been raised by her cousin Mordecai, who serves under the king's gate. And interestingly, archaeology even mentions a Persian official named Marduka, possibly the very same Mordecai. Funnily enough, the woman of God, Esther, wins the beauty contest and is chosen as queen. Meanwhile, trouble brews in the shadows. A royal advisor named Haman plots to destroy all the Jews across the Persian Empire. He's manipulative, he's proud, and unhelpfully close to the king's ear. When Mordecai learns of the plan, he sends a message to Esther. You're in this palace for a reason, and maybe this is your moment. The tension is brutal. If Esther speaks up without being summoned, she could be dealt with suddenly. But if she stays silent, her people will die. So, she bravely risks everything and walks into the throne room uninvited. Esther breathed a sigh of relief when the king held out his golden scepter. This was a symbol of mercy and acceptance. Before we discover what happens next, just remember this. That moment is a really beautiful picture of Jesus. He is our golden scepter. He is the one who bridges the gap between God and us. Because he became the substitute for our sin on the cross, we can now come boldly before the King of Heaven and enjoy fellowship with our Creator. But there is a catch, and it's only if you and I, like Esther, will take the first step and approach the king for help and for salvation. Okay, so Esther has done just that. She's asked for help and she's exposed Haman's plot. The king is furious and has Haman put on the very gallows that he built for Mordecai. The Jews are saved, and in fact this act of courage is still remembered today in the Jewish festival of Purim, celebrated every spring. When I first started this study, I was really surprised because there is something very remarkable that happens. All of this action happens inside of a Persian court, in what is now the heart of what we call Iran. So can you also see how Iran keeps recurring again and again in the Bible? Well, in a moment's time, we are going to see how the world will end with Iran, with a very famous end times prophecy, and then I'll show you one that's not so famous. It's 450 BC. Persia is still the superpower of the world. The same empire that once crowned Queen Esther now rules from the palace at Susa, deep in modern day Iran. Hey, let's meet another Jewish servant who changed the world. He's called Nehemiah. Nehemiah was a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes I, who reigned from 465 to 424 BC. Now, a cupbearer wasn't just a waiter. He was one of the king's most trusted officials, close enough to taste the royal wine before the king did, just in case someone tried to tamper with it before it reached royalty's lips. What would you do if you were in his shoes? One day, Nehemiah hears devastating news. Jerusalem, his people's city, still lies in ruins. The temple had been rebuilt decades earlier under Zerubbabel and Ezra. But the city walls, they were now rubble. Defenseless, a ghost of its former city. If you've never tried prayer, may I challenge you to try it, because big things happen when we pray big prayers. And this prayer was what emboldened Nehemiah to ask permission from the most powerful man on earth to rebuild the city walls. You probably already know that the king said yes, so let's travel to 445 BC, because it is here where we will see Nehemiah setting out across the desert from the royal court of Persia to the broken streets of Jerusalem. Picture this, enemies threatening him from every side, but he doesn't give up. No, instead he organizes builders, families, even priests to grab tools in one hand and protective devices in the other. Are you imagining this right now? Because astoundingly, in just 52 days, the wall rises again. Between you and me, this isn't just a legend written in a book. Archaeologists have literally found it. In Jerusalem's ancient city, near the step-stone structure, researchers uncovered a massive wall, 19 feet thick, built directly over earlier ruins. The pottery fragments around it date precisely to the Persian period, and the construction looks rushed, just as Nehemiah described. It even matches the sections built by Shalon, mentioned in Nehemiah 3 verses 15 to 16. So again, I'll ask you, can you see this pattern repeating throughout the history of Iran? Well, I'm going to choose my words very carefully, but think about it. A Persian king funds the restoration of a Jewish city hundreds of miles away. In other words, the Empire of Iran plays a direct role in rebuilding Jerusalem's story, and that is why their biblical destiny is even more fascinating later on. There is an even more famous example of this, and it happened centuries later in 4 BC. Persia is about to play a key part in the announcement of the coming of the Messiah. In Matthew 2, the Magi, aka the wise men from the east, traveled to Jerusalem following a star asking, "Where is this newborn king of the Jews?" Okay, it's mega important that we don't forget that their nationality isn't directly mentioned, but evidence points to the ancient lands of the Medo-Persian Empire, modern-day Iran, and these men, scholars of astronomy and prophecy, likely studied Daniel's writings, including the 70 weeks prophecy. And if you're a Bible student, you'll know that it outlined the timeline of the Messiah's arrival. Again, my friend, we cannot say for certain that's what guided them, but we do know that they recognized the significance of the star, and they journeyed across deserts bearing gift of gold, frankincense and myrrh, each symbolically representing Christ's kingship, divinity, and final sacrificial mission of dying upon a cross for the sins of the world. Okay, I know exactly what some of you are thinking. You're saying, Joe, I bet the unheard of prophecy you've been hyping up for this entire video is this one. Well, I'm afraid you'd actually be wrong. Kind of. In the book of Ezekiel, written around 580 BC, the prophet describes a war unlike any other. In this war, a coalition of nations rises from the uttermost north. And who are they led by? Well, it's by a mysterious figure named Gog from the land of Magog. His armies sweep towards Israel, and among the nations with him, one name stands out even today: Persia, modern-day Iran. Guys, to really grasp this, we have to go back to Genesis and back to Noah again. Noah's son Japheth had descendants named Magog, Meshech, and Tubal. Ancient records trace their migrations northward across the Caucasus Mountains into the vast plains that would one day become Russia. So it's time we fast forward to Ezekiel's time. Babylon is still a powerhouse. Persia is just emerging and Israel is living in exile. Yet Ezekiel sees far beyond his own century. He describes a leader, Gog, the chief of Meshech and Tubal, who would come from the far north to invade a restored Israel in the last days. The Hebrew phrase literally means the uttermost parts of the north. From Jerusalem's point of view, there's only one nation that fits that description perfectly: Russia. Now, I'm not going to say anything else on this because some of you know I did a deep dive into ancient history on why I do believe this is Russia in a previous video. But I will also say this: I could be wrong, and some of you I know strongly disagree with this viewpoint. Anyway, whether you believe it's Russia or not, this is fact now. Next to Russia is Persia or Iran, and they are directly named in Ezekiel 38 verse 5. Alongside them Cush, which many of us know to be the modern day Ethiopia, and Put is Libya, whilst Gomer many believe is to be linked to early German tribes. And Beth Togarmah is well known to be ancient Turkey and Asia Minor. This is a pretty unusual alliance, part Middle Eastern, part European, and part African, and yet all marching towards Israel. Now, according to our timeline, this prophecy was written 2,600 years ago. And yet, the alliances we see today, Russia's partnership with Iran, and then there's this cooperation with Turkey, and even influence spreading across Africa, it mirrors what we've heard in the Bible with an uncanny precision. But I believe that's nothing compared to the way that the world currently views Israel. I won't say any more on this apart from this. Can you think of another country that all the nations of the world are watching and are openly unifying against, just like the Bible predicted would happen in the last days? Comment below if you think I'm reaching here, because again I'll say I could be very wrong about this, and these are just my interpretations on these subjects. Alright, if all of that made you think outside of the box, wait until you see this. Why did I say no one can explain this timeline? And why do I think very few know about this hidden Bible prophecy about Iran? Well, this is why. Iran is a nation that once saved Israel. It later betrayed Israel, and one day it will be saved by Israel's God. Let me break it down step by step. As we follow the biblical thread, you've got Cyrus the Great freeing the Jews in 539 BC, Darius I supporting the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, Artaxerxes granting Nehemiah permission and resources to rebuild Jerusalem's walls, and even the Magi from Persia honouring Jesus centuries later. A remarkable pattern of Persia appearing again and again as a surprising deliverer of God's people. Persia begins as a deliverer, becomes a worshipper with the Magi, and then becomes an enemy, and then finally somehow ends up as a redeemed people. A four-act divine irony written across millennia in the pages of the Bible. Cyrus is even called by the name in Isaiah 45 long before he's born as my anointed one, the man who would set the captives free, and he does. Centuries later, the Magi from Persia bow down before God incarnate, showing that the empire that once released God's people now worships him. And then history turns. Persia, modern-day Iran, reappears in a prophecy as part of the Northern Alliance in Ezekiel 38 and 39, standing with Gog against Israel. The very nation that once delivered God's people becomes part of the force that tries to destroy them. Isn't that a huge plot twist? But wait, there's more. Remember how I told you that there seems to be a special place in God's heart for the people of Iran? Well, here's the proof in the prophecy that no one seems to talk about. In the last days, I will restore the fortunes of Elam, showing that Iran is not doomed forever. It will be humbled, yes, but then restored. I wonder, what goes through your mind when you hear that? Because Zechariah 14 verse 16 echoes this vision. The survivors of the nations that march to Jerusalem will come back to celebrate and worship the King. And I think that means Elam itself. This nation that was once consumed by fury will now be filled with praise. Let me let you into a secret. I also have a special love for Iranians ever since we first started to do a Farsi Bible study at our church, because the Lord kept sending Iranians to our church who wanted to learn more about Jesus. Above all, if you are a Christian, you too should start remembering Iran in your prayers. Because if I was to ask you which country in the world right now has seen the most converts in the last 10 years, what would you say? Well, the answer is actually Iran. Despite intense circumstances, Iran has experienced one of the most remarkable Christian revivals in modern day history. Estimates suggest that between 800,000 and 3 million Iranians have converted to Christianity in recent years. This growth is huge, especially considering that in 1979 there was believed to only be 500 Christians in the entire country. And get this, reports even indicate that 2,000 Iranians every day are turning to the Lord Jesus Christ in repentance and faith. So, over to you. How do you untangle all of this then? Because the destiny of Iran isn't just national, it's also personal for you and me. What God does for Iran, He does for every believer. He takes what's opposing Him and He makes it holy. He redeems what's rebelled and restores what was lost. The same pattern runs through the gospel. We were once enemies to God, yet Romans 5 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Judgment became mercy and wrath turned into grace. That's why this timeline matters. Even a nation that was destined for judgment isn't beyond redemption. Cyrus opened the gates of Babylon to free God's people, and centuries later, Jesus opened the gates of death when He rose from the dead to free all people who will trust in Him. At the very end of the world, when the nations gather in worship, I do believe one of them that will stand there, humbled and restored, will be Iran, singing to the same king the Magi once knelt before. So if you remember one thing, remember this. No nation, no country, and no heart is too far gone for God's love and for His restoration. But hey now, if you're still saying to me, Joe, I just don't understand how Russia could possibly fit into Bible prophecy, well, you should probably check out this video here that went very viral on my channel a few years ago.